He was only meant to fix a system failure. She was fighting a betrayal that could destroy her empire. One late-night knock on his door changed everything between them forever. The days after that lingering moment by the elevator carried on with the same steady rhythm life always seemed to insist upon. Yet, for Liam Brooks, something subtle had shifted beneath the surface of his ordinary routine. Mornings still began with the familiar chaos of single parenthood, burnt toast scraped into the sink, mismatched socks retrieved from beneath the couch, and Mia's bright voice filling the small apartment with endless questions about stars, dinosaurs, and why cereal tasted better in the blue bowl than the red one. He moved through these rituals with practiced efficiency, packing lunches and braiding messy hair, while reminding himself that stability was the one gift he could always give his daughter. But even as he hurried through crowded buses and dim office corridors, there was a new awareness threaded quietly through his thoughts, a presence that lingered without demanding attention, like the memory of music still echoing long after the last note had faded. He found himself thinking about Ava Carter at unexpected moments, while waiting for coffee to drip into a chipped mug, while rebooting yet another stubborn computer, while standing in line at the grocery store staring at labels he barely read. He wondered whether she still stood by those floor-to-ceiling windows late at night, gazing out at a skyline that must have felt both triumphant and isolating. He wondered if she allowed herself to pause, even briefly, or if the relentless machinery of her responsibilities pulled her forward without mercy. These thoughts unsettled him more than he cared to admit, not because they were dramatic or overwhelming, but because they were steady and persistent, like a quiet tide reshaping the shoreline of his inner life. He reminded himself that their connection had been born out of coincidence and circumstance, a fleeting intersection between two vastly different worlds. Yet no amount of logical reasoning could fully erase the memory of the way she had looked at him, not as a technician fixing a problem, not as an employee filling a role, but as someone whose presence mattered in a way he wasn't accustomed to feeling. At Carter Global, the days passed in a blur of routine tasks and polite conversations, but even the familiar hum of servers and the glow of office screens seemed altered somehow, as if the building itself held a secret only he could sense. Colleagues joked and complained in break rooms as they always had, yet Liam moved among them with the faint impression that he was standing just slightly outside his own life, observing it from a distance. It wasn't dissatisfaction exactly, nor was it excitement. It was something quieter and far more complex, the awareness that one unexpected encounter had opened a door inside him he hadn't known existed. Meanwhile, on the top floor, where decisions shaped markets and headlines, Ava Carter experienced a change no less subtle and no less profound. Her schedule remained relentless, her voice remained composed, and her reputation for calm authority remained firmly intact. Investors still deferred to her judgment, executives still measured their words carefully in her presence, and the endless stream of emails and meetings continued without pause. Yet, in rare, unguarded moments between obligations, she found herself noticing the absence of something she hadn't realized she had begun to rely on. The silence in her office felt different now, no longer the comforting neutrality she had once welcomed, but something more reflective, more aware. She would glance toward the seating area where they had spoken with unexpected ease, half expecting to find him there again, offering an honest observation or a quiet understanding that cut through the noise of corporate performance. It unsettled her to recognize how quickly that sense of connection had taken root, how naturally it had softened edges she had spent years sharpening for survival. She told herself it was nothing more than a passing curiosity, the mind's tendency to romanticize moments of vulnerability. And yet, when she stood at the window watching the city lights flicker awake each evening, she felt an unfamiliar sensation stirring beneath her carefully controlled exterior. Not loneliness exactly, but the realization that the life she had built, impressive and formidable as it was, contained spaces she had never truly explored. Somewhere between Liam's small apartment filled with laughter and Ava's vast office wrapped in quiet ambition, an invisible thread had begun to stretch, delicate yet unbreakable, connecting two lives that had once moved in entirely separate directions. Neither of them spoke about it, neither of them fully understood it, but both carried the quiet certainty that something had begun, something neither routine nor distance could easily erase. In a place like Carter Global, silence was never truly silent. It was simply the space where speculation gathered its strength before finding a voice. Within a few short weeks of Liam's unexpected presence in strategic meetings and closed-door discussions, the atmosphere inside the sleek glass tower began to shift in ways that were subtle enough to deny, yet impossible to ignore. He noticed it first in the way conversations paused for a fraction of a second when he entered a room, like the final note of a song being cut off mid-air. Assistants who had once greeted him with casual familiarity now offered polite nods that felt rehearsed rather than warm. Executives glanced at him with curiosity sharpened by quiet skepticism, their eyes lingering just long enough to suggest that questions were forming behind carefully composed expressions. Liam told himself it didn't matter. He had spent most of his adult life navigating spaces where he felt slightly out of place, learning to carry himself with quiet resilience even when doubt crept in like a persistent shadow. Yet there was something about this particular shift that unsettled him more deeply than he expected, perhaps because for the first time in years he had allowed himself to believe he was being seen for more than his job title. The confidential project he had agreed to join demanded long hours and careful thinking, drawing him into a world of strategic language and high-stakes decisions that felt both thrilling and disorienting. Ava, true to her word, encouraged his perspective, often turning to him in meetings with a calm invitation to speak when others hesitated. Her confidence in him was steady and unwavering, but outside those rooms, the whispers grew louder, feeding on the natural human instinct to question what they didn't understand. One afternoon, as he waited for the elevator, he overheard two senior managers exchanging low-voiced remarks about favoritism and emotional judgment, words that lingered in the air like an accusation he hadn't been given the chance to answer. He stared at the reflective steel doors, catching sight of his own uncertain expression, and wondered whether stepping into Ava's world had been a mistake neither of them fully anticipated. On the top floor, the tension revealed itself in more controlled yet equally telling ways. During a quarterly board review, a veteran investor known for his diplomatic candor leaned back in his chair and spoke with a tone that suggested concern masked as professionalism. He questioned the wisdom of reshaping internal structures so quickly, of trusting untested voices in matters that influence the company's direction. Ava listened without interruption, her posture composed, her gaze steady, embodying the authority she had spent years perfecting. She responded with clarity, emphasizing innovation, perspective, and the value of truth over comfort. Her words were measured and persuasive, but as the discussion continued, she felt an unfamiliar undercurrent of scrutiny pressing against her carefully maintained equilibrium. It wasn't that she doubted her judgment. She had built her success on trusting her instincts when others hesitated. What unsettled her was the realization that this decision, inviting Liam into her inner circle, felt different from any strategic risks she had taken before. It wasn't purely intellectual or financial. It carried an emotional weight she could neither quantify nor dismiss. After the meeting ended and the boardroom emptied into the muted hum of afternoon activity, she remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, her fingertips tracing the edge of the polished table as if grounding herself in the solidity of its surface. She knew how perception worked in environments fueled by power and ambition. Leaders were expected to be decisive but detached, visionary yet unyieldingly rational. The idea that personal connection might influence professional trust was something the corporate world rarely forgave, particularly in a woman whose authority had been questioned more times than she cared to count. Later, standing by her office window as twilight softened the city's sharp outlines, Ava allowed herself a rare moment of introspection. She thought about the ease with which Liam had spoken to her that first afternoon, the quiet honesty that had slipped past her defenses without effort. She wondered whether the board's concerns were rooted in logic or fear of change, fear of authenticity, fear of a leader who refused to separate strength from humanity. Meanwhile, miles away in a modest apartment filled with the comforting clutter of real life, Liam helped Mia finish her homework while pretending his thoughts weren't circling the same unresolved questions. He laughed at her jokes, reheated leftovers, and read bedtime stories with the same gentle patience he always had. Yet when the lights dimmed and the world finally grew still, he found himself staring at the ceiling with the uneasy awareness that rumors had a way of shaping reality long before truth had the chance to catch up. Somewhere between boardroom doubts and whispered hallway judgments, an invisible pressure had begun to build, testing not only his place within Ava's carefully constructed universe, but also the fragile connection that had begun to feel unexpectedly important to them both. The invitation to Mia's school science fair was never meant to carry any significance beyond the ordinary rhythm of Liam's life, yet from the moment he mentioned it in passing during a late evening strategy session, something in Ava Carter's expression shifted in a way he couldn't quite define. He had spoken casually, almost apologetically, explaining that he might need to leave a meeting early the following Thursday because Mia had spent weeks building what she proudly described as the most explosive volcano in third-grade history. He expected polite acknowledgement at best, perhaps a brief nod before the conversation returned to profit projections and operational models. Instead, Ava surprised him by pausing mid-sentence, considering his words with an attentiveness that felt deeply personal rather than professionally courteous. After a moment, she said simply, "I'd like to come," as though stepping into his world required no elaborate justification. The gymnasium at Mia's school was a far cry from the immaculate conference halls Ava was accustomed to navigating. Its fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, illuminating crooked poster boards decorated with glitter, crayon diagrams, and handwritten labels that reflected more enthusiasm than accuracy. The air smelled of paste, warm sugar cookies, and the faint rubbery scent of gym mats that had seen better days. Parents clustered in uneven groups balancing paper cups of punch, while children darted between tables with boundless energy. Ava stood just inside the entrance for a moment, absorbing the unfamiliar chaos with a composed stillness that made her seem like a visitor from another dimension. Her tailored suit and polished heels felt almost surreal in a space filled with sneakers and laughter, and for the first time in years, she experienced a flicker of uncertainty that had nothing to do with market fluctuations or investor expectations. Before she could overthink her decision, Mia spotted Liam across the room and rushed toward him with the unstoppable momentum of childhood excitement. When she noticed Ava standing beside him, her curiosity sparked instantly, her wide eyes scanning the elegant stranger as if assessing whether she belonged in this unpredictable, joy-filled environment. Within seconds, Mia slipped her small hand into Ava's and declared with absolute conviction, "You have to see my volcano first, or it might explode without you." The earnest urgency in her voice dissolved any lingering hesitation Ava might have felt. She allowed herself to be guided through the maze of folding tables, listening intently as Mia launched into an enthusiastic explanation of chemical reactions and geological formations she had memorized from an online video. Liam followed a few steps behind, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of amusement and quiet awe. He had witnessed Ava command boardrooms with effortless authority, had seen seasoned executives adjust their posture when she entered a room, yet here she was, kneeling slightly to meet Mia at eye level, asking thoughtful questions about baking soda ratios and lava flow patterns, as though nothing in her life had ever been more important. When the makeshift volcano erupted in a frothy cascade of orange foam, Mia clapped her hands in triumph, and Ava laughed a genuine, unrestrained sound that seemed to surprise even herself. It was a moment so simple, so grounded in shared delight, that it carried an unexpected emotional resonance. For Liam, seeing Ava immersed in this slice of ordinary life felt like witnessing a secret he had never been meant to uncover, a softer dimension of her personality that corporate mythology had never allowed to exist. For Ava, the experience stirred something deeper than novelty. She realized she was not merely observing a different lifestyle, she was participating in a kind of connection she had long ago convinced herself she didn't need. As the evening unfolded, Mia insisted on introducing Ava to her friends, proudly announcing that she was Dad's important work friend who laughs at science jokes, a title that made Ava smile with an unfamiliar warmth. They sampled homemade cupcakes that leaned precariously under excessive frosting, admired cardboard solar systems suspended by fishing line, and applauded when a group of students demonstrated a clumsy but enthusiastic robot built from recycled parts. Each small interaction chipped away at the invisible armor Ava had worn for years, revealing a growing sense of ease she hadn't anticipated. Later, when the event wound down and the gym began to empty, they stepped outside into the cool night air. Street lights cast soft halos on the pavement, and the distant hum of traffic felt almost soothing after the lively noise inside. Ava inhaled deeply, as if grounding herself in the simple reality of the moment. "This feels more real than anything I've done all week," she admitted quietly, her voice carrying a sincerity that made Liam's chest tighten. He glanced at her, noticing the way her expression had softened, the tension in her shoulders easing in a way he had never seen within the walls of Carter Global. "It's messy and loud," he said with a faint smile, "but it's honest." She nodded, watching Mia skip ahead toward the car, her silhouette outlined by the glow of passing headlights. In that instant, Ava understood that the world according to Mia was not defined by quarterly targets or strategic victories. It was defined by curiosity, by shared laughter, by the unspoken assurance that being present mattered more than being perfect. And as she stood there beside Liam, feeling the quiet afterglow of an evening she hadn't known she needed, stepping into his life had opened a door inside her she could no longer pretend didn't exist. The crisis did not arrive with dramatic announcements or flashing alarms. It crept in quietly, like a draft slipping through an unseen crack in an otherwise flawless structure. At first, it was only a subtle irregularity buried deep within internal reports, a discrepancy in projected data that no one outside a small circle would have noticed. Then came the confirmation that confidential information connected to Ava Carter's highly protected initiative had surfaced in places it should never have reached. The realization spread through Carter Global with the unsettling efficiency of a whispered rumor turning into undeniable truth. Meetings were suddenly rescheduled, security protocols tightened, and conversations lowered to guarded tones that seemed to follow Liam Brooks wherever he went. He felt the change before anyone said a word to him directly. The friendly nods he had begun to grow accustomed to were replaced by polite avoidance. Doors that had recently opened now remained closed a fraction longer. Even the hum of the building's vast technological system sounded different, as though the very walls were listening, waiting, judging. Liam told himself it was temporary, that investigations were part of any high-stakes environment, but the knot forming in his chest refused to loosen. He had stepped into Ava's world with cautious hope, believing honesty and effort might be enough to bridge the distance between their realities. Now he wondered whether that belief had been naive, a quiet dream colliding with the sharp edges of corporate survival. Meanwhile, Ava faced a storm that tested more than her leadership. It tested the fragile trust she had allowed herself to place in someone who had come into her life by accident and stayed by choice. Advisors urged swift action, recommending she distance herself from anyone who could even remotely be associated with the breach. Their arguments were logical, grounded in precedent and perception, delivered with the calm authority of people who had spent years protecting institutions from scandal. Ava listened with the same composed expression she always wore during moments of pressure, but inside something more complicated was unfolding. She understood the stakes. She knew how quickly public confidence could fracture. Yet when Liam's name surfaced in quiet speculation, her instincts pushed back with an almost visceral certainty. She remembered the unguarded way he spoke about his daughter, the steady sincerity in his voice when he offered an opinion that challenged her own. None of it aligned with the image of the trail others seemed ready to construct. Still, doubt lingered like a shadow at the edge of her vision, not because she questioned his character, but because leadership demanded she consider every possibility, even the ones that hurt. For Liam, the weight of suspicion revealed itself in subtler, more personal ways. Invitations to strategic meetings ceased without explanation. His access to certain systems was temporarily restricted under the guise of routine security measures. Colleagues he had begun to respect now avoided prolonged eye contact, their discomfort a silent acknowledgement that his presence had become complicated. At night, he returned to his small apartment, exhausted not from physical labor, but from the emotional strain of existing in a space where every action felt scrutinized. He tried to maintain normalcy for Mia, helping with homework and laughing at her imaginative stories, yet even her bright energy could not fully dissolve the sense that he was standing on uncertain ground. He told himself that stepping back might be the only way to protect Ava from further criticism, that distance could serve as a shield for them both. The decision felt both noble and painfully isolating. Ava noticed the shift immediately. The absence of his quiet observations during meetings created an unexpected void, one that strategic reports and polished presentations could not fill. She found herself scanning rooms for his presence, only to remember that he had retreated to the periphery, intentionally or otherwise. One evening, as twilight settled over the city and office lights flickered on like distant constellations, she stood alone by her window, grappling with the realization that success had always required sacrifice, but she had never considered sacrificing trust itself. The glass tower that symbolized her achievements now felt like a labyrinth of expectations, its reflective surfaces showing her not just the powerful executive the world recognized, but the woman questioning whether strength could coexist with vulnerability. Somewhere below, Liam exited the building unnoticed, his shoulders slightly hunched against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Neither of them spoke about the widening space between them, yet both felt it with quiet intensity. In the heart of Carter Global, where ambition thrived and certainty was prized above all else, shadows had begun to stretch across the fragile connection they had built, testing whether something genuine could survive in an environment defined by risk, perception, and the relentless pursuit of control. Ava Carter had built her entire life on decisions that required clarity under pressure, yet nothing had prepared her for the quiet, relentless weight of uncertainty that followed the data breach. The situation demanded swift resolution, a decisive display of leadership that would reassure investors and stabilize the fragile confidence rippling through Carter Global. Advisors urged her to delegate the investigation to internal security teams, to maintain distance from the process so her judgment would appear impartial and unclouded by personal bias. But something in her refused to step back. She had spent years trusting systems, trusting hierarchies, trusting the carefully structured mechanisms of corporate control. This time, her instincts insisted that truth required something more direct, more personal. So she began to review every detail herself. Late nights blurred into early mornings as she pored over technical logs and operational timelines, her office lit only by the cold glow of screens and the distant shimmer of city lights. The quiet hours revealed patterns others had overlooked, inconsistencies buried beneath layers of routine procedures, subtle manipulations masked as harmless adjustments. She moved through the investigation with calm precision, asking questions that unsettled those accustomed to her delegation rather than her scrutiny. Some responded with defensiveness, others with rehearsed confidence, but Ava's focus never wavered. She felt driven not only by responsibility to the company, but by an unspoken need to protect something intangible that had begun to matter far more than quarterly projections. Meanwhile, Liam navigated his own form of isolation. He had deliberately withdrawn from the spaces where their paths once crossed, believing distance was the most responsible choice he could make. Each day he immersed himself in smaller, familiar tasks, repairing malfunctioning laptops, updating outdated software, answering routine support tickets, yet the work felt strangely hollow compared to the purposeful engagement he had briefly experienced. He told himself that stepping back was an act of integrity, a way to prevent his presence from complicating Ava's already difficult position. Still, the absence of their conversations lingered like an unfinished sentence, leaving him with the unsettling awareness that silence could sometimes wound more deeply than accusation. Even Mia noticed the change, asking one evening why he seemed quieter than usual, her innocent observation cutting through his carefully maintained composure. He reassured her with a gentle smile, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed his own explanations. As the investigation intensified, Ava uncovered evidence that shifted the narrative entirely. The breach had not originated from Liam's access points, as many had assumed. Instead, it traced back to a senior executive whose long-standing reputation had shielded him from suspicion. The discovery carried a bitter clarity, exposing how easily fear could distort perception when combined with ambition and self-preservation. Ava confronted the individual with measured authority, presenting the facts without theatrics or anger. Her voice remained steady as she outlined the consequences, not only for the company, but for the trust that had been compromised. The revelation spread quickly through Carter Global, silencing rumors and forcing a collective reevaluation of assumptions that had seemed so convincing days earlier. For Ava, the outcome brought a profound sense of relief, tempered by introspection. She realized how close she had come to allowing external pressure to dictate her response, how easily she might have sacrificed authenticity for the illusion of control. That evening, as she walked through the now quiet corridors of the building, she paused outside the technical support department where Liam worked. Through the glass partition, she saw him focused on a flickering monitor, his posture slightly slumped, yet his expression calm in its concentration.
The sight stirred something resolute within her. She understood then that leadership was not merely about preserving reputation, it was about defending truth, even when it complicated expectations. When she entered the room, the hum of electronics filled the brief silence between them. Liam looked up, surprise flickering across his features before settling into cautious neutrality. Ava stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "It wasn't you," she said softly, the simplicity of the statement carrying more weight than any formal announcement. He nodded once, absorbing the words without triumph. In that moment, both of them recognized that the real victory lay not in proving innocence, but in choosing courage over fear. Ava felt the tension she had carried for weeks began to ease, replaced by a quiet determination to redefine the boundaries she had allowed others to set. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual relentless energy, unaware that within the glass tower, a different kind of decision had just been made. One that prioritized honesty, connection, and the fragile yet undeniable strength of trusting what felt true.
The rain began sometime after midnight, a soft, persistent rhythm against the windows of Liam Brooks's small apartment that blended with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of a clock he had never gotten around to replacing. Nights like this usually brought him a sense of calm. They gave him space to breathe, to exist outside the constant expectations of work and responsibility. Yet tonight, restlessness followed him from room to room like an uninvited guest. He tried to distract himself by organizing Mia's school supplies, by rereading emails that no longer required his attention, by standing at the sink watching water spiral down the drain as though clarity might appear in its slow disappearance. Even after Ava had quietly confirmed his innocence earlier that day, something remained unresolved between them, an invisible thread stretched taut by weeks of distance and unspoken questions. He told himself that resolution would come with time, that life had a way of smoothing sharp edges if you let it. Still, when the unexpected knock sounded at his door, cutting cleanly through the muted hush of the apartment, his heart reacted before his mind could form a logical explanation. He hesitated only briefly before crossing the narrow living room and turning the handle. Ava Carter stood in the hallway, her dark hair dampened by rain, her expression composed yet undeniably vulnerable in a way he had rarely seen. She wore no visible armor of authority tonight, no entourage, no guarded posture, no carefully measured corporate cadence, just quiet determination that seemed to glow beneath the soft yellow light overhead. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside felt distant, reduced to the steady patter of rain and the faint echo of traffic several blocks away. Liam stepped aside instinctively, not as a grand gesture, but as a simple acknowledgement that whatever had brought her here deserved space to unfold. Ava entered slowly, her gaze taking in the modest surroundings with thoughtful attention rather than polite curiosity. She noticed the stack of storybooks on the coffee table, the child's drawing taped unevenly to the wall, the worn comfort of a life shaped by love rather than luxury. It grounded her in a way she hadn't anticipated. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the calm sincerity of someone who had spent hours rehearsing truths she was only now ready to admit aloud. She told him she had finished confronting the realities within her company, that she had chosen to defend what she believed rather than what others expected. But she wasn't there to discuss professional outcomes. She was there because she had come to understand something far more personal, that the peaceful version of herself he had glimpsed in that photograph was not an illusion tied to a distant memory, but a possibility that could exist in the present if she allowed it. Liam listened without interruption, feeling the quiet gravity of her words settle around them like a shared understanding. He realized then that connection was not always built through dramatic declarations or sweeping gestures. Sometimes it emerged in the simple act of showing up, of standing in someone else's reality without pretense. Ava admitted she was tired of living a life measured solely by achievements that felt increasingly hollow when experienced alone. She spoke of the strange courage it had taken to knock on his door, of the uncertainty that still lingered despite her usual confidence. In response, Liam felt the familiar warmth he associated with moments of truth, the steady reassurance that authenticity, though fragile, had the power to reshape even the most carefully constructed boundaries. He offered her a cup of tea, a small domestic ritual that transformed the charged atmosphere into something softer, more human.
They sat side by side on the couch, listening to the rain as though it were narrating the quiet evolution of their story. Neither rushed to define what this new chapter meant. They simply allowed themselves to exist within it, aware that the future would bring its own complexities and choices. When Ava finally rose to leave, dawn was already hinting at the edges of the night. She paused at the doorway, her expression illuminated by the first pale light filtering through the hallway window. "I don't want to go back to who I was before," she said, not as a plea, but as a promise to herself. Liam nodded, understanding that transformation rarely arrived with certainty, but often began with a single open door. As she stepped into the morning air, the rain had softened to a gentle mist, and the city seemed to hold its breath in quiet anticipation. Behind her, the door remained slightly ajar, a silent symbol that whatever lay ahead would be faced not with fear, but with the fragile, hopeful courage of two people choosing to believe in something real.
If this emotional story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Drew Daily Stories for more powerful love journeys, unexpected twists, and unforgettable storytelling every week.